Hello and welcome back to the Lib Dem Podcast. I'm joined again by Councillor Jake Austin from Stockport. We're going to talk about the local elections, a little bit of a preview, because now, Jake, we have the number of people who have been put themselves forward as candidates. That's been released. We're getting a little bit of an idea of what the campaign is going to be like. We've seen lots of paid deliveries by people like Reform. What does it feel like on the ground? Dare we do predictions, Jake?
What's the fun in talking about local elections if we don't try and do some predictions?
Given my track record of predictions, we'll see how this goes. But yeah, my name's John Potter. I'm a councillor in Preston, and I host the podcast. And Jake's with me today. So let's do the numbers first of all, Jake. So we've got the candidates have been announced.
Yes.
So how many candidates have we got for each party for these local elections?
So bizarrely, John, topping the list of candidates is actually Reform UK.
Okay.
Who are standing 1,705 candidates, which I think is actually more candidates than are being elected. Maybe?
No, there is, because I do think there's an area where they've put 3 people forward for 2 seats.
No, they have done that, but apparently they are contesting 97.4% of all seats.
Yes.
So there are still a few, 2.6% of areas that are being fought by Reform candidates.
We are obviously politically very different to Reform, but you kind of got to respect that organisation to get that sorted, though.
From the absolute, they've obviously been buoyed by the general election, but in terms of coming from essentially nothing all the way to this many local candidates within this local election period is pretty insane.
Yeah.
Pretty insane. After Reform, you've got the Tories, of course. They're on about 96% of seats, just under 1,700. Labour just over 1,600 on about 93.5%. And then you've got us Liberal Democrats just under 1,500 on about 85% of seats, and the Green Party on about 1,250, and they're at about 71%, 72% of seats.
And obviously it was a small round of elections anyway, but obviously we've had several of the councils have now had their elections postponed because of the new local government reorganisation, including some ones we would have expected to do quite well in, such as Surrey and places like that. But I suppose this is an improvement in Lib Dem candidates. I think it's about a 4% increase, on what we did in 2021.
I think so, yeah. I think so.
And first, I suppose we should say is just thank you to everyone that's put themselves forward, because we know that, taking that step to be even a paper candidate, all parties struggle with it.
100%.
So whether you're standing in a place where you're literally just a name on a ballot paper, this really matters, because it gives everyone a chance to vote Lib Dem and assesses where our base is as well.
Yeah, my first by-election was in 2017. It was the first time I'd ever stood in any election. It was absolutely terrifying. But had a few elections since then, so I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge everybody who's standing. All 1,474 Liberal Democrats,
including myself. So as listeners know, that I'll be getting progressively more stressed, more grey, and slightly more tanned as we go, which is because the weather's been glorious.
It's amazing.
But I suppose, Rick, one of the big things about this local election, and there's been a lot of commentary about, is where we were 4 years ago. And it actually kind of boggles the mind to think 4 years ago, Boris Johnson was riding high, vaccine boost. The Tories given they had been in power, had such a good local elections in 2021. And so actually from a defending point of view, but obviously always a double-edged sword, when you have a couple of good sets of elections, makes it really difficult later on. And Lib Dems are going to go through that in the next couple of years, coming down or hopefully staying where we are from good elections. But the Tories are defending over 1,000 seats this time.
It's insane. I mean, we always expect during the county council elections that there are going to be a significant amount of Tories to defend.
Yeah.
But just to sort of illustrate how much has changed in the last 4 years, 4 years ago, Matt Hancock was crying on TV because of the vaccine rollout, as he was so happy about finally getting the vaccines out. Since then, he's been on I'm a Celebrity and is now no longer an MP at all. So it's just so much has changed in those last 4 years. Not just the Conservative Party, but I think they have definitely been the bastion of how much a political party can change within such a short amount of time.
And 4 prime ministers.
4 prime ministers,
which actually again it does. When you think about that, it really does. It is staggering, actually, how much that has changed. But so the Tories are defending an extremely high base. They had a really good set of counties, and obviously we also know that really, I mean, we had a fringe event on this at November conference or the autumn conference, where the counties have always been in an awkward place for the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
They've either been with European elections, with general elections, during COVID, when I first elected in 2017 to the counties, it was halfway through a general election was called and things like that. It's been a real pain. So actually, I think it's going to be a good year for the Lib Dems, and we'll discuss soon how good we think it will be. But so the Tories are defending 1,002 seats, we believe. Labour 312. So even though Labour, well, again, we'll talk about this, might be having a difficult time.
They didn't have an easy election in 2021, did they?
No, that's right, because it was Corbyn.
Starmer had just become leader.
Starmer had just become leader.
It was his first local election test, and people weren't impressed by it.
And remember 2021, what was actually that election? It was Hartlepool.
Yeah.
The Hartlepool by-election where they lost it that day.
Lost it to Boris Johnson. Well, not literally to Boris Johnson.
And it was, and that was the big story of 2021, was actually Hartlepool and I'm reading the book Get In, sorry. I'm reading the book Get In, all about Keir Starmer's rise to power, and actually that was a real inflection point in history where Keir was literally on the edge of saying, nah, screw this, I'm done with it, I'm not the leader to do it. So that's where Labour are coming from. Lib Dems, 228.
Yeah, we had an okay election.
Yeah, I think we stayed exactly on.
We had like
8 or something like that.
Something like 4 or 5 councillors that we gained in 2021.
And then the Greens on 38, which you'd expect they might do slightly better. Although we'll talk again about the Greens. Maybe they're not doing as well or meeting as expectations as we thought they would.
They're not capturing as much of the. We'll go more in depth in it later on. But they certainly aren't capturing as much of the public's imagination as you might have expected a small party to do in this climate.
And then 297 independents. Now, interestingly enough, and I can speak about again in Lancashire. Obviously, since that time, we've obviously had a large growth of Labour councillors going independent in that time as well. And not all of them, in fact, very few of them have actually gone back to Labour since. So that's another really interesting dynamic in this election. So let's have a think. So we'll deal with the Tories first because they have the most clue. So, listeners and viewers, I want you to kind of play a theoretical game with predictions and see how me and Jake do. What percentage of seats do you think the Tories will keep this election? Because everyone is expecting a bad night for them. Kemi Badenoch is already kind of laying the groundwork, also expectation managing what they're going to do. She was already on the Sunday shows doing that. So what kind of level of defeat do you think the Tories might get?
This is really tough because they're defending about 1,000 seats. You mentioned, didn't you? And Labour did rubbish last time, so I would expect Labour to still potentially lose seats, but maybe or make small gains, but still have generally a rubbish night. But any gain that Labour has is going to be an improvement on what they did in 2021. With the Tories, with them defending so many seats because of the highs of 2021, and we were talking before of just how much they've changed, essentially how much they've come crashing down. We've seen the national poll that came out from YouGov today, and that put the Tories in third place on about 22%
that's
of
right.
the national vote.
So, they're just hovering at that point. Put the polling and just generally politics in the UK at the moment is complete. It
reminds me of the Brexit period where we had those polls where the Lib Dems were sometimes in second place.
That's right. And again for listeners, that's basically there are 4 main parties all within 7 points of each other. This isn't the first poll that's done that as well. And the Greens also hitting around 9-10% as well. So how that matters, it just means it makes it really difficult to predict.
It does. But one thing I can predict is that the Tories will definitely be losing seats.
Yeah.
I think a really bad night for them would be 500 plus losses.
So losing 50%.
Losing about 50% of the seats. And I would not be surprised if that were to happen, especially because the biggest competition doesn't necessarily come from Labour.
Yeah.
It does often come from Liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
But it actually, a lot of the time, also comes from Reform, who might not even win seats, that many seats, or make that many gains. They will make gains, but how many we'll see. They will certainly, though, eat into the Conservative vote and just hasten that downfall. And so a 500 plus night loss for the Tories would be bad, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were to happen.
And I do wonder if the Tories are going to lose some, because obviously we saw just before the general election, and it happened in the general election, Tory to Green switching, which was definite thing. That kind of, we say there's kind of two types of Green kind of party members. Is kind of the ex-Corbynites, the watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. But there's also this kind of affluent suburban Greens that obviously did take seats off the Tories. But again, we'll get to the Greens later on. I'm not predicting masses for the Greens. I think they'll be very much, if they have someone who's really good or a team that's really working, they might do it. But the areas that are up, I'm dubious what the Greens will do. But I think the Tories, I've been staggered by the canvassing I've done, how little bounce back of the Tories. If anything, it's got scarier for them because it feels like they're almost irrelevant.
Well, that's the thing that really gets me about the Conservatives at the minute. So you would expect, after they've just lost a general election, it has been, 7-8 months since July last year when we had the general election. Labour got a massive majority. You would have expected now the Conservatives to start to pick back up again. The problem is exactly as you said, they are completely irrelevant in the public's head. Nobody, when I'm door knocking in my constituency, in my ward, people just aren't even mentioning the Conservatives. Like, people just don't even talk about them because they're irrelevant.
And we know now from polling, and obviously, and we know, listeners and viewers, that polling comes with a huge pinch of salt.
Yeah.
But Ed Davey has better awareness levels than the Tory leader.
It's just insane, isn't it?
It just doesn't. I mean, and it will be, and we'll see what happens. An existential threat to the existence of that Tory party. I'm not sure they've ever faced, because they're losing votes everywhere.
Literally everywhere. They're losing votes to us in a lot of the heartland blue wall seats that we managed to capture in the general election, which will inevitably, should we put in the work for it, make gains in. Yeah. They are maybe not so much losing seats to Labour at the minute, but they certainly did during the general election. They're losing mindshare to Reform. As you say, there's a sort of teal sort of Tories who are losing seats to the Greens as well. Every single direction the Conservative Party is being pulled in at the moment.
And I'm going to talk about Lancashire quite a bit because it's the bit I know most of, but it's also a really good barometer because Lancashire has been a marginal Labour then Tory, then it's been Tory for the last 2 terms, but really on a knife edge. So there are quite a few seats in places like Rosendale and places like that in which the Tories won from Labour by the slimmest, like 3 figures, really, really small majorities. And I would say, this time last year before the general election, Labour were absolutely certain they were going to take them back. And we're going to talk about Labour in a second. But can the Tories hold? Has there been that much of a shift? I would think the Tories are probably more worried about Reform than us than Labour. Because, it's really difficult. Because I assume also the Tories will be thinking, what might save us is our vote tends to be less apathetical on the day, more postal voters, slightly more elderly, so that might just keep those seats. But it's going to be tight for them.
Agreed.
And I suppose one of the big threats for the Tories is, of course, us. And and Ed Davies made that really clear. Well, as soon as the general election had gone, he said, "Look, we want to finish the job." Was kind of his thoughts. And again, our launch was in Oxfordshire, one of the counties we're actually defending. And I should point out, we don't actually have a majority in Oxfordshire or Cambridgeshire, but they are no overall control. Lib Dems.
That could change though.
That could change, and that's one of the things we're hoping to get. Now, here's a really frightening thought for the Tories. How many of their councils will they actually keep? Because you could generally see them losing all of them.
Well, if they lose 500 plus seats, I mean, how many are they going to be able to hold on to at all?
Yeah. And that's not going to say Labour majority. And again, I can talk about Lancashire. At the moment, the Tories, Lancashire's got 84 councillors. 40. They only need to lose 6 to lose that majority. They're going to do that. They are definitely going to lose 6 seats, and they're not going to be able. If they do make an odd gain against Labour here, that's not going to offset the Lib Dems, Independents, Greens, Reform that are going to take him off them. So I can't see how the Tories hold on to Lancashire, and I assume that's going to be the same across vast areas of the country.
Well, they'd have to do deals with people to be able to keep power. Because in a lot of these places where they do lose seats, there is a strong chance that they will still be the largest party, including probably in Lancashire as well.
Yeah, I would say so.
And so they're going to have to do a deal with somebody to try and keep power.
And then that comes to a really big question to listeners and viewers is, who do they go into deals with? Because, Lib Dems aren't going to go with Tories. I know. I mean, there are
most Lib Dems.
Yeah, most Lib Dems. and as those of us who are in local government know that actually local government throws up all sorts of weird and wonderful bedfellows in terms of parties going in with each other that you'd have thought you couldn't imagine them going in together. And obviously, to those Lib Dems that do end themselves in no overall control, even if you're a tiny group, make sure you seek advice.
Absolutely.
Don't rush into anything. Talk to the LDC, talk to the LGA.
Yeah.
There are lots of places because we've seen, as I work here in LDC offices, that some groups basically go from nothing to something and then have to make real big decisions about, okay, who do you go into power with, or who do you do a confidence and supply arrangement with. It is really tough out there.
I've got every confidence that Lib Dems, they're not shirkers of responsibility. No. If they feel like there is a reason for them to do this, then I'm sure they can step up to the plate. But I think it's just so vital that people seek out advice about doing that before they make any decision, because there are going to be a lot of circumstances where county councils are in the balance and some smaller parties hold the balance of power. For a lot of councils, it's likely going to have to be multiple parties holding the balance of power, which gets messy. Really messy.
And what Lib Dems also have to remember is that you've got to protect yourself as well. So some of these parties and some of these leaderships in Labour groups and Tory groups will be grizzled old veterans at this sort of stuff, and will know every trick in the book to be able to put you on the back seat when you're
making it sound like the 2010 election.
It does. It feels like it. It does feel like
coalition.
But lessons from history and all that, isn't it? It's about learning those mistakes. But I suppose one of the big threats to reform, as well as us, because we're going to do very well. I'm expecting. I mentored the Shropshire Lib Dems at Kickstart. They are all guns blazing. They are looking like that might be a really good night.
Shropshire's one of the ones we're expecting to do quite well on. If we have a good night in Shropshire, it's going to be quite a lot of.
Because I think they're on 18. I want to say maybe 17, and they might double, triple. Who knows what's going to happen? So they're. I mean, but you never count any chickens in this game. And the thing that is causing a lot of stir is obviously reform. And their impact, because this kind of four-party politics makes predicting really difficult, but also the winning margin a lot lower than what you'd expect.
Absolutely. Reform is a really interesting one, because if this election had happened a few months ago, I would have expected to Reform to potentially have done better than what we're expecting to do now.
Because of Trump and Putin and stuff.
There's been a lot of international problems where Reform have, Nigel Farage in particular, who likes to tie his face to everything that Reform does, has tied himself so closely to Donald Trump that we're seeing things like what's happening in Canada, where Pierre Poilievre, the Canadian Conservative, has tied himself really closely to Trump, has now dropped massively in the polls. In Australia, the coalition, the Liberal Coalition and Liberal National Coalition, have dropped in the polls because of their more closeness to Trump. And a similar thing has happened to Reform a little bit, in that their shine has been tarnished, I think, partly because of their associations with what's been happening internationally. Whether that affects county council elections, that's another question.
And Reform's going to think, because I think it's difficult for Reform, and I try and put myself in where the opposition are, because if you're a Conservative councillor now, you just want to bury your head almost and just work hard, hope for the best, but with Reform, and it's generally curious, because obviously we've talked about the organisation, getting that many candidates is impressive, but that's something regional offices with staff and a decent HQ setup that they're clearly investing in. That's true.
And the people clearly have people willing to stand as well.
That is also. So they've got those 200,000 members, fans, whatever they call themselves. But doing the groundwork is not something you can always dictate from the centre. And one thing I've said on the podcast numerously, if you're asking Lib Dem HQ to win your election as a Lib Dem, you're probably going to lose. They'll help, they'll do bits and pieces, but ultimately you have to be the master of your own fate.
I think it's so with local elections, or with elections generally, we often think as politicians that so much of it is out of our control and is down to national politics. And for Liberal Democrats, we're sometimes thinking we should be doing more in the media because that's going to really help us in the polls, and we'll do better in elections as a result of that. With local elections, though, it is just almost entirely down to obviously national politics has
Yeah.
a factor and an effect on what people do. And if you're a really hard worker, a really good councillor who's defending, or a really good candidate that's done a lot of work for your area, you could still lose because of national issues. But you will win because of the work that you do as an individual and the work that your team does. And I think Reform have yet to kind of understand that with local elections.
And Reform are going to have a good night. I don't think we should deny ourselves.
No.
You know, they have a level of support which is very, very vociferous, but also they have a lot of people that don't like them as well. So I think Reform are going to have a decent night. They'll probably have the most gains on the night because obviously they're starting from nothing, which helps.
That does help.
I mean, if Lib Dems were starting from nothing, 2021 would have been really bad, but also I think we would be right up there in terms of most gains, but we're obviously starting with 228 already in the bank, so to speak. But I think Reform might be not disappointed, because don't forget there's a parliamentary by-election in Runcorn which you would expect them to win.
They're doing quite. It's pretty much on a coin flip between Labour and Reform at the minute.
So they've got that, and then obviously we'll talk about the mayoralities as well, because there you've got 4 big mayoralities, of which Lincolnshire might go to Reform. So you can see Reform on May the 2nd on May the 3rd, by the time all the things are counted, is actually thinking, well, we've had a parliamentary by-election win, most gains in the local elections, and won a first regional mayoralty. That's pretty good going, but I would be wondering if, because I see Reform, there's a Reform person against me, there's a lot of people who have that kind of almost delusion that they'll walk into it. Now, if I end up getting beat by Reform, I don't think I will, but I think Reform are probably going to come second, maybe push Labour into 4th in my seat, would be where I kind of think it's going to be. But I think there'll be that reality check they'll probably get this time. It's a bit like the people who were massive fans of Corbyn. They couldn't understand how nobody could not vote for Corbyn. And I think Reform might just be at that point where they need to have a little bit of disappointment to realise actually you've got to work harder.
I think they see themselves as the natural replacement for the Conservative Party's massive downfall, and they feel like they're ready to step into the shoes of the Conservatives. I think this local election is going to be a real test. The issue is, of course, when it's done, exactly as you say, Reform are currently on 0 councillors. Or, well, they've had some defections, of course. So not starting from literally 0 councillors, but they have so few councillors at the minute that no matter how many gains they make, it's a positive story for them.
But defections won't count in the tally when you're on when they're getting counted. So the 2 Tories that defected to Reform in Lancashire right at the end because they got deselected, but those 2 won't count. They'll count as Tories moving over to the Reform pile. But no, it is, from my point of view as well, from what we're seeing from they seem to be quite focused in certain pockets. They're doing social media everywhere, and they're doing quite a good job of doing social media clustering where everyone, so the Ribble Valley Reform Group talks to the Preston Reform Group, talks to the South Ribble and the West Lancs or whatever else, and they're all sharing and retweeting and all their stuff. So they're making a lot of noise online. Genuinely, from my point, they're going to do better than what they did. So in we only had 1 Reform candidate last year in Preston, and they got about 10%. Now that might go up to 17, maybe 20 or something like that. That's not going to be enough for them to win those seats, and it's going to hurt a lot of Tories doing it.
So they'll be second or third in a lot of places and do considerably better. It'll be similar to what happened in the general election, won't it?
Yeah, it will.
But they had a pretty big national vote share. They did get 5 MPs, which has now become 4 MPs, and came second in a lot of places, more places than we probably expected them to, which is potentially disappointing for them in the case they might not make as many gains for councillors as they would expect, but it is a step on the ladder for them, and it's a pretty big step if they manage to get a lot of second places.
And what they'll need to do is back that up in 2026 and 2027, because it's likely that these counties aren't going to exist. This will be the last election for a lot of these counties, being replaced by unitary authorities probably in 2027. So what do Reform do in that time? Because you never know. We talked about the troubles Tories might be in. Do we think Kemi Badenoch will still be leader by 2027? I mean, I think that's a bit of a coin flip for me, really, whether she will be.
I give her a few months after the local elections.
The thing, yeah. I mean, it's not been great. I mean, it's a funny one for the Tories. I mean, they might be thinking, well, a Robert Jenrick will probably protect them from that reform flank a bit more. But we had the same discussion about, I can't remember which politician it was probably about Labour, in fact, saying, why would you go for a slimmed down version of Farage when you can just have Farage?
Yeah, but that's right at the start of this, when we started talking about the Conservatives, we mentioned about how they were bleeding voters from essentially every political wing that they have. They've got to choose a leader that can patch as many of those as possible.
Yeah.
Do we think Robert Jenrick's the kind of person to... Kemi Badenoch's clearly not the person to do it.
But natural human instinct is to double down sometimes on your mistakes. And I think they chose Kemi Badenoch. I think they'll double down to it. And there will be. And don't forget, members of political parties are always more radical than their MPs.
It's true.
And so they'll probably think, oh, well, we just weren't right-wing enough.
Yes, that is true. That is true. But we'll see what happens, and we can't count our chickens before they're hatched.
No, yeah.
Because for all we know, they might not lose any seats.
No.
To local elections.
And one thing, and there'll be some Lib Dems listening to this who will be thinking, oh, we should be going out on the attack against reform. And I think you've got to remember that reform are basically trying to steal our clothes in terms of our campaigning tactics and things like that.
They're learning a lot of Lib Dem techniques when it comes to campaigning right now.
But we have better experience and we're doing it for longer. And I think, and like I said, their unfavourables are far more unfavourable than ours, because the Lib Dems are the least toxic of the parties. And in fact, almost like everyone's favourite second party.
I think Ed Davey was one of the only politicians in the UK to have a net positive approval rate.
That's correct. And so Lib Dems have a greater opportunity to get that anti-establishment vote.
Exactly.
But what Lib Dems have got to do, and I realise this is now, we're right in the middle of the election, postal votes are landing pretty soon, is that we have to establish ourselves as the challengers. And so if you haven't got elections this year, or you're thinking of the unitaries in 2027 or whatever, get out early. I mean, we've always, ALDC, Lib Dems, win before Christmas.
Yeah.
It has never been more vital.
Working hard all year round.
Exactly, but, you know...
If you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready.
Yeah, and part of the thing is, and one of the other things about starting early is not only it establishes yourself credibility as the main challengers to the top two, it also means, if it's going to be a unitary authority, big all-ups, you're going to have lots of areas, you're going to stress your small teams to their absolute limit. Starting early means you can think, okay, sometimes people say, okay, we're definitely not going to win that ward, we should actually move resource elsewhere. Or the other way, we're definitely going to win that ward, we can pile into our more narrower seats. And that's just, and what happened in the general election, we were efficient with our vote. And that's what we've got to be locally, is efficient with our time to get that vote out.
But it wasn't just us that were efficient with our votes as Liberal Democrats. The public was also more attuned to the kind of voting that gets rid of the Tories than they've ever been before. And we're now in a position in these local elections where there is so much apathy, not just for the Tories, but for both of the big parties in the Tories and Labour.
So do you think turnout is going to be very low in this election?
I think so, but turnout is always low in local elections. So, I think it will be lower than it usually is.
So there's a gradual decline, basically, because in Preston we have elections every year. And so we saw from maybe a standard 33% in local elections, that probably dropped down to maybe 28, 27 by 24.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was the same across the whole country. We kind of saw this after Blur had his massive majority in 1997. Is that with the years afterwards?
It's after the Lord Mayor show, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So the political engagement just drops off.
Yeah.
The change has been had on a national level, at least politically. People are probably not feeling the change so much actually happening.
And that will be a scary thing for reform. Yeah. And it will also be the big thing. So again, Lib Dems, if you're not sure what you're doing with box counts and all those other things, doing your tally charts, figuring out your turnout stats, getting your marked registers is a really important fact. Because what I'll be looking for is how many people go out to vote who don't normally vote. Because that's what reform is. And you can see it from their social media, their posts. They are really going hard on, don't forget your vote. Don't forget your vote.
Because so much of their core support comes from people who don't normally vote or have never voted before. Yeah. They have obviously a substantial amount of people who are ex-Tories or even potentially ex-other parties that are coming to them from being politically minded and now suddenly deciding they're being reformed. But the vast majority of their support on their base comes from people who are just have always hated politics and they hate politics so much they want to vote for politicians that proclaiming to shake it up.
Yeah, and I think that will be really fascinating, because if Reform do that, then that's a huge sea change, and that is something where we'll talk about predictions. If they do that, the Tories are really going to struggle, but so will every other party.
Yeah.
That's their fear. And so it gets now onto Labour.
Yes.
Okay, so like I say, they're not defending loads. However, they are defending Doncaster Council, I think, is their one unitary that's up this time, or Metropolitan, I can't remember what it's actually officially classed as. But Doncaster's up. Labour are in real trouble.
Oh, 100%.
And we talked about the Tories losing vote everywhere. And more so, because not only have you got Labour moving some to Tory, to Reform, to Greens, to Lib Dems, but also loads of independents.
Yeah, I agree. We do have to consider, though, that Labour did have a bad night in 2021 as well. Yeah. So even if they have a bad night tonight, there is still every chance... Tonight. Even if they have a bad night tonight, hopefully every night.
I missed the election.
Let's hope Labour have a bad night every night up until the election. But if they have a really bad night on Thursday, the 1st of May, then it might not actually look as bad in terms of council gains or losses as we would expect it to, because they're starting from, much like Reform was starting from a platform of zero. Any gain that they make is going to be positive. Labour's floor is quite low.
Labour's story will be they're not the story.
Yes, they don't have a hurdle to jump this time.
No. I mean, they'll probably, I don't know the mayoralities. I mean, the mayoralities are interesting, particularly, we've had Mike Ross on the podcast.
Yes.
That's a big battle between Lib Dems and Labour in Hull and East Yorkshire, where they hold. But I think a good night for Labour will be roughly holding their own in terms of 300 seats, keeping maybe one or two of those mayoralities. Well, there's two that are new and then I think they've probably priced in that they're going to lose that Runcorn by-election.
Yeah,
but
if they hold on to the Runcorn by-election, and I'd say it's probably a 60-40 chance Reform Labour as to what's going to happen with that at the minute.
Yeah,
it will be a good night for Labour, and that will be the main headline of how Labour have done, is that they managed to hold on a by-election. That was going to be a tough fight. They're not going to be so bothered about what happens on the county. Well, of course they are bothered, but in terms of the narrative that weaves for what Labour are doing right now, they're coming in from a massive majority. People are obviously disappointed with them after decisions that they've had to make at a national level. Their line is just going to be, we know we're an unpopular government, we know we are going to lose seats, that's natural for incumbent
stick
governments.
With us, it will get better, is their kind of, and I suppose it's a slight risk, because I remember during all those parliamentary by-elections we had at the tail end of the Tory government, I remember canvassing people saying these were soft Tories because they were Tory seats, and I remember saying, look, this isn't going to change the government. You can vote to say something to protest at the government, reward your hard-working Lib Dem candidate who seems to be quite good, without risking it's going to collapse the government. I wonder if Labour's going to have to struggle with that, because if I was reforming Runcorn, that's exactly what I say. Give Starmer a message.
It's what we say in the Does. It's what we said during every local election that I've ever run on. It's always a case of, especially now in Hazel Grove, where I'm in a Tory-facing ward, it's we need to send a message to the Conservative government. That's obviously going to change now, because but it's the same message. It's we need to send a message to the Labour government. What they're doing isn't good enough, so you need to vote Lib Dem at the local elections.
And actually, one thing we ties Labour and Reform together, actually, I don't know where their activists are. This is the other thing. I mean, obviously, Labour activists are fairly depressed in terms of being in government and having to do very awful things. But in terms of Reform, what we didn't, because again, Reform doesn't have this ground game yet. And again, I'm going to keep referring to Reform and Jeremy Corbyn because it could be very similar. So Jeremy Corbyn, 500,000 members, the biggest, one of the biggest political parties in Europe.
But are they going to go out knocking on doors?
Yeah, they didn't. That's it. They weren't campaigners.
Exactly.
And so I do wonder, because I was at a Reform public meeting, and it was packed. Now you're not seeing that on the doors where I am, but what activists they've got? If you were a Reform activist that's willing to go anywhere, you'd go to Runcorn.
Yeah.
Because that's their story, isn't it?
Exactly. If Reform take Runcorn, then that is a massive win for them.
Yeah.
And I've found that so unusual with Reform at the moment in terms of the capture that they have in the media. We spent a significant portion of this podcast talking about them because of the impacts that they're having on national politics.
Yeah.
But in terms of, exactly as you say, their growing campaign is is growing, but it's not at the same level as other parties yet. Particularly, exactly as you said, you see them having huge public meetings with loads of supporters being there, rallying around them. But in terms of actual people delivering leaflets, knocking on doors, talking to people, trying to actually win the election, I'm not saying it's not there, but I'm saying it's not as impressive as you would expect based on the noise that we've heard from them.
And we do have to be a little bit weary of shy reformers as now. We used to be all shy Tories, didn't we? It was really interesting. I was canvassing a guy who was Labour leaning previously, and didn't want to say which way he was going to think of voting this time. And my instinct was, I wonder if he's going to go Reform, but doesn't want to say anything. But it might just be that, as those of us at canvass, sometimes if he's a Labour supporter in a Tory Lib Dem marginal, he didn't want to say that he was going to stay Labour, or he didn't want to say he just wasn't going to bother this time. People generally are very polite and don't want to disappoint you on the door. Greens.
They exist. They're a thing.
Again, they've done all right with getting their candidates. I think that's, again, there's a little bit of credit there. Another slightly below what we've got. They've done a full slate in Lancashire, which is interesting, and you can see from the things that addresses it, like candidates in Preston that have addresses in Chorley or wherever else. So they've clearly got that door. I'm in a real. I just forget about them, and that's not me being snide or nasty. They're just not even remotely in the conversation, and that's something people say about us. But Greens have to be part of that conversation if they're going to build, because they're not a populist party in terms of like reform. But I don't want to break any confidence, but a Green Party member was saying to me they're not expecting massive uplift in their councillors this time.
No, but why would they? Because the mind share for Greens at the minute is pretty low. I find the story of the Greens really interesting right now, because you consider that they have the same amount of Ps, technically now more than Reform, because they've got 5 MPs.
Got 4.
Oh, they get 4 MPs.
They've got 4, so they're now on the same as Reform.
They're on the same as Reform in terms of the number of MPs. Technically, although in national vote share, in terms of number of MPs, they did almost just as well as Reform did. But they just do not have the mind share, and it's almost kind of funny watching Green supporters or Green politicians get really frustrated about the lack of attention and support that they get from the public sphere and the mind share that they have in people's head, compared to someone like Reform, who's just dominating every single conversation. But the reality is that the Greens have existed for a long time and are not on a stratospheric transition upwards in the same way that Reform are. They largely coasted on I would argue that they largely, most of their gains from the general election were down to anti-Tory bias rather than necessarily support for the Greens. And now they're in a position where they're just sort of steadily chugging onwards as they usually do. And
it's because obviously that I would say actually for the general election, I thought the Greens camp was they were pitching themselves as left of Labour.
Of course.
As the left's largest part, like most prominent party in that election, probably. And it's slightly awkward because obviously the Greens in Scotland are a different party, so it becomes, and then you have SNPs and nationalists in other bits. But it's a funny, and again, it's a strange one as well, because I'm a big believer in the need for good climate policy, for better environmental policies, and Reform are very much doing this scrap net zero, blah blah blah, all those stuff they come up with. You'd think there's a natural point there for the reverse, because actually, if you look at polling, still the public still really cares about climate change. They still want to improve their air quality and everything else. The Greens are not cutting through on any of these issues.
I think the problem is that we as Liberal Democrats have almost sucked the air out of the room when it comes to when people think of the juxtaposition to what the Reform Party is. They're not really thinking Labour, and they're not thinking the Greens. In fact, actually, a lot of the time, and if you're looking at what the political, the diopposed view of what Reform politics is, people sometimes look to Liberal Democrats because we're the Liberals.
And I suppose, and if you think of response to Trump, you mentioned about Reform and Trump, actually, who has been the outspoken voice? It has been Ed Davey.
It's been Ed Davey. He even got tweeted by Elon Musk, didn't he?
Did he get called a cretin or something terrible like that? So that's really interesting in terms of where the Greens will be. But I think a bigger story, and we know there's 300 of them, is the independents. Now obviously there are independents and there are independents. Some of them are just basically Tories that don't want to be called Tories, or or Labour.
There used to be ex-UKIP people a lot of the time, like those little community independent groups that basically formed out of UKIP, the bottom falling out of the party of UKIP. Of course, they've now got a home in Reform UK.
Yeah.
But there's still so many of those.
So Tory-leaning people that would go independent would just go to Reform. Now, what we saw in Lancashire and other areas is during the war in Gaza, loads of Labour councillors defected to independent. The ones in Lancashire, of which I want to say there's about 5 or 6, I know for a fact that Labour are actually thinking, okay, these guys might come back hopefully in time. They have not. So that is really... So we're talking about, whether Labour will go down, because again, defectors don't count on these things. So if you think of Labour at 312 seats of defending, there's a fair chunk of them
who've already disappeared.
Who have already disappeared. And so actually Labour could go down to mid-200s, even with technically not losing seats, if that makes sense. But how Labour deal with that is going to be really tough. And when we look at our by-election results that come up every week that LDC kind of report on, we know a good independent... Labour can't hold out these good independents. No. And so all this kind of makes a complete kind of spaghetti bolognese of an election where there's stuff everywhere.
I think it's a really good example of why you can't use local elections to paint a picture of what the entire national politics looks like.
Yeah.
But it does give you an indication of the direction that we're heading in for the future.
Yeah, and you're right, because that direction is, if these things carry on, and the kind of a consensus will be, and I'm sure Tory HQ is thinking this, that as we get to a general election, the thought it will either be Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch and squeeze that Reform vote. Labour, as they have done for a very long time, squeezes that Lib Dem vote.
Yeah.
It'll be me or him, and basically kind of that. Well, we use it all the time. Anyone that does campaigning, you all know about your three S's, and one of the most important ones is your squeeze vote. It will be really scary for Labour and the Tories if this shift continues.
Almost the opposite has happened, really, hasn't it? We've gone from Labour and the Tories in the last general election being able to squeeze as much as possible. Particularly the Tories getting absolutely squeezed by every party left, right and centre.
And voters understanding that as well.
Exactly. It's going to be an interesting set of elections for sure, John.
Yeah. So, listeners and viewers, hit us in the comments, see what you think. So we reckon about 50% Tory losses. So we also think probably Reform having the most gains.
Yeah.
Good result. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, and we should talk about actually, is we talked about lots of these councils going from Tory to no overall control. I think a big story for the Lib Dems actually will be, we might be the only party to gain councils.
I think we will. I think it's on a good night. I think there are 4 or 5 councils that we could definitely take control of.
Yeah. So that would be our big sign point. Gaining that, if we can gain the Hull and East Yorkshire mayoralty, gain councils, that is our story. Now we know, and Lib Dems, you'll throw your TV off the wall and things like that. We know Reform is going to be the story. I think regardless of what happens, even if Reform have a slightly...
they gain 2 councillors, they'll still be the story.
Yeah, they will still be the story because, the audience loves the circus and Nigel Farage is a circus master.
I'm quite interested on how they're going to report Reform gains, because if they're starting from 0, it's technically an infinite percentage increase.
Yeah, that's right. But no, well, like I say, do hit us in the comments. Thank you so much to Jake for because I think this is genuine. And let us know, obviously without giving away any secrets, how you're finding it on the doors, because I know I do a lot of campaigning and do a lot of my own work, and I can see that Reform is actually fairly bitty in terms of where they're targeting, what they're going to do. Will that translate? Will they get their vote out? So do hit us our thoughts on YouTube, on all our social media, comment, and obviously like us as well. Why not be nice and just like us? So thank you so much everyone for listening. Thank you for everyone for standing, as we said before. Do get out there, do win these seats, because this is also an opportunity. And I've said this for the last kind of year and a bit. I've been saying these county elections are a massive opportunity for the Lib Dems, with the Tories and Labour being in the doldrums. As Jake has said, there's been no discernible bounce in the Tory vote. There are areas, and there'll be shocks. That's the other thing as well. There'll be shocks this year.
I love an election shock.
And again, we always do this after the election, but for those that don't get over the line, and I've been in ones where it's generally been a good night for the Lib Dems, and locally we haven't quite done it, or we've just missed out. It is really hard. So make sure you are managing yourself, you are managing your expectations, and you have good people around you that can look after you regardless of the result, because these elections are only for really 2 years, and then you've got your big unitaries and your other elections happening across the country. So but last words from you, Jake.
If you're listening to this podcast and you're not currently delivering leaflets, what are you doing? Grab a bag, grab a round, stick your headphones on, and go out and deliver at the same time.
There you go. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you in another episode very soon.